If you spend enough time looking into language learning methods on YouTube, you'll quickly notice that immersion and comprehensible input come up constantly. In some cases, the emphasis on immersion is so extreme that it's presented as the only method, hence the famous meme, just immerse bro. Now, after a lot of studying and learning two languages before and currently working on my third one, I formed my own thoughts about immersion and the idea of learning like a baby and how various aspects of this theory impact the language learning process. And the thing is that, to me, there's a common misconception that all you should do is immerse yourself, and that's it. So today, I want to share my own experience and journey to walk you through how I reach proficiency levels in different languages using, of course, immersion along with other methods, and where I stand in this, let's say, debate. Should you immerse? Is immersion the only thing you need, or there are other valid ways of learning a language? First of all, what's immersion, or at least how it is understood in the language learning community? A simple way to put it is that the idea is to emulate the conditions you would face if you were living in a country where your target language is spoken. To do that, you kind of adapt your surroundings to be constantly fitting your target language. So you do things like change the language on your phone, label things with their translations, and most importantly, you should start consuming a lot of media from that target language. Trying as much as possible to stay in that artificial environment will eventually lead you to fluency, or at least that's kind of the idea. Some people online consider this the superior way to learn a language. Some recommend immediately starting with native content, and others recommend beginners start with comprehensible input, which means you need to understand at least a certain percentage of what you are consuming to slowly acquire the language. So as you can see, there is plenty of room for trying different things, but something that bothers me and that I've noticed with a lot of YouTubers in the language learning community is that they tend to discuss topics as if things were just black or white. In general, I think language learning is such an interesting and rich process with so many different approaches that it's worth exploring various opinions. I also found it interesting that a lot of people tend to put things into perspective, if not backtracking, at least clarifying certain ideas they had presented in previous videos. I mean, it's normal to just change opinions, but it feels like many YouTubers play this game of sounding controversial to spark debate and encourage comments to create some chaos, so to speak. But in real life, I don't think people are as extreme with their methods as they often present themselves here in YouTube. So with that said, I want to start by sharing my thoughts on immersion and how it has played a role in my own language learning experience. I'll walk you through how I learn English, also how I learn French, and how I'm learning right now Japanese. But before I even start talking about my journey with languages, I need to get something off my chest because it's been eating me alive. Let me be clear, I'm completely pro-immersion. I fully support consuming a lot of media to learn a language, whether it's through reading, listening, watching, or having conversations. All of that to me is essential and will definitely help you reach a good level of fluency. However, I do have some caveats, which I'll explain later when I walk you through my own language learning journey. Now, what really frustrates me is how often you hear people say, just learn like a baby. Babies do this and babies do that when they are talking about immersion or getting a lot of input. The problem is that a lot of people oversimplify language learning by comparing it to how babies learn. They act as if babies just absorb language through tons of input and that's it. But this completely ignores the fact that while babies are learning a language, they are also learning everything else about the world. A baby's brain is developing and processing countless things at once: how to move around, how objects are, how to eat, and even how to, go to the toilet. They don't even know how to read or write. Their brains are building frameworks to understand reality itself. And somehow, we just boil down to learn like a baby. It's bizarre to me how oversimplified this idea has become. Now, I'm not saying everyone literally means you should learn like a baby, but a lot of people take this concept too far. Babies don't just magically speak perfect English or Spanish or whatever language. If you take a 3-year-old, he's nowhere near articulating words like an adult. He's not going to understand or enjoy, 100 años de soledad. Even in our native languages, we struggle for years to become fluent in all of their aspects. I think initially we are exposed to very descriptive and slow-paced forms of speech, while of course being surrounded by daily life conversations that, while evading our understanding as babies, eventually start making sense. At least for myself, I'm not sure how it is in other countries, but I went to elementary school and had classes specifically dedicated to learning Spanish, my own native language. I had to study reading comprehension, read a lot, learn how to write properly, and how to understand the grammar rules. And yeah, granted, if you ask me about those rules nowadays, I can barely explain them. But that time in elementary school was fundamental in developing my understanding of my own native language. And even then, I needed to go to university, read tons of material, explain complex topics, and give countless of presentations to get to the point where I'm today. So when people say learn like a baby, it just doesn't align with the reality of what most people want to achieve. That's of course if you only want to consume simple content, have basic conversations, and structure your thoughts in a basic way, which is totally okay, by the way. So if that's the only objective, well, then go for it. And yes, kids can say amazingly complex sentences sometimes, and that's impressive, but they are still far from being fluent in the way you might want. Now, personally, I don't want to speak like a 4-year-old. My goal is to use a new language as effectively as I use my own native language. And as an adult, that means you can use different tools to be more efficient in the process compared to what a child goes through. I think I've vented enough about that, and we've clarified that it's not like a baby hits 1 year old and suddenly speaks like an adult. So, where do I stand in this constant debate about massive input when learning languages? What's the most efficient approach, or the superior one if you want to call it like that? Well, to explain that, let me dive into my journey with learning languages and show how immersion has played a role in that process. I started learning English when I was about 16 years old, around 2008, 2009. To give you some context, back then YouTube was still in its infancy. There weren't nearly as many videos or learning resources as we have today. There was no Netflix, and at least for me, the internet was still pretty slow. Being 16 and aiming to get into med school, my only reason for learning English was to have a tool that would help me once I entered university. The logical thing for me to do at the time was to go to an institution and take classes. I guess the conventional way of learning a language. Just sitting there, having a teacher, working with textbooks, doing homework, taking tests, and all of that. I took classes 5 days a week, 2 hours a day, for probably 8 months. And after those 2 hours, I would go straight home to play World of Warcraft. I did other things, of course, but that was the gist of it. Looking back, I'd say those classes gave me a solid understanding of grammar and language rules, probably up to B2 level. I think it was a good platform that eventually allowed me to start consuming media in English. So call it efficient or inefficient, that's just what happened. Once I got into med school, things changed. I had to read an insane amount of content. Research papers, medical books, all in English. I wasn't sleeping much. I was just reading, learning. It was a brutal experience, but also fascinating. As the years went by, platforms like YouTube and Netflix appeared. I also got into drawing and building Gundam model kits, and most of the available information was in English, so without even thinking about it, I began to consume tons of content in English. By the way, I forgot to mention that after all those 8 months of classes, despite covering B2 level grammar, I was still very much unable to use the language, at least in the way that level suggests. Anyway, fast forward 7 years, I was already a doctor, and then I found myself at a, I would say, crossroad. I decided to change everything and shift my career toward art, and to do that, I took the IELTS academic test to meet the visa requirements for an art institution in Canada. Now, keep in mind that during those years, I never actually spoke English with anyone. Nobody around me spoke English. I never forced myself to practice speaking. For me, learning English was just a very gradual, natural process. It was more like one day I just realized I could understand the language. And when it came time to take the IELTS test, honestly, I was surprised by how well I did. I was able to communicate my ideas, even if I hesitated a lot and made a lot of mistakes. So let's break it down, how I did in each section of the test. Reading, I pretty much aced it. I think I scored a band 9, which means I got almost everything correct. No surprise there, because I was used to reading complex text and research papers. Writing, well, it wasn't bad, but not great either. Same with listening. I don't remember my exact score, but I think I did well enough. Now, speaking, this is where things get interesting. Like I said, I had never practiced speaking with anyone, but I do remember speaking to a mirror during some weeks leading to the test. Of course, I also look up the test structure because there's always a structure, and to my surprise, even though I wasn't perfect and still making mistakes, I was able to speak and answer questions. And one of the things that shocked me the most was that I recognized grammar patterns I had never studied. Academic tests normally don't ask you things like, is this, a present perfect tense? They just give you prompts and you have to fill them with the most logical answer. And I say logical because that's how it feels. For me, everything was based on intuition. I was answering questions based on what sounded right. Now, after living in Canada for 5 years, my English still not perfect. Far from it. I still make a lot of mistakes every day, and some days my brain just dies and I cannot pronounce a single word in English. That happens. I think that's normal though. I don't know. Let me know if you also speak another language, if also that happens to you, that suddenly you just cannot say a word in the other language. Or another thing that happens sometimes is that I don't realize I'm speaking in French or in Spanish. Like I'm confusing languages. I forgot where I was. God damn it. So I lived in Canada for 5 years and I was still sucking hard. I also never really focused on speaking. I never did shadowing, pronunciation exercises, or anything like that. And granted, I had my struggles the first year living abroad, but I can't really pinpoint the exact moment when I became fluent. I think it was such a long time that it just happened. Now, French was a different story because I started learning it around 2022. And by then, we had all these modern tools and theories. Stephen Krashen became an idol for many YouTubers, and the whole concept of immersion and input was now a thing. Naturally, I gravitated toward what seemed like the most efficient way to learn a language because I only had about 7 months to prepare for a test. I don't remember exactly the name of the test. I think it was the TSF, and I only needed to take the speaking and the listening test. You had to score B2 to meet the government requirements. So with only 7 months to get ready, I had to figure out a plan. Just to add some context, at that time, I was living in a place where everyone spoke French. That was the main language of that city. So you might think I would have learned French faster, but far from it. I was mostly focused on improving my art skills, so I relied on English to get by. It worked, but to be honest, I totally regret that. I'm mentioning this just to say that you can absolutely live immersed in a language in another country and still make zero progress. You might pick up basic things like greetings or asking for a bag at a store or saying you want to pay with a credit card, but beyond that, your proficiency won't improve at all. It took me 3 years to finally decide to put real effort into learning it. At first, I felt completely disconnected from the language learning process because more than a decade had passed since I actively tried to learn a language. I decided to spend the first 5 months doing almost pure immersion. Alongside that, I finished the French course from Busu to have the basic grammar down, and I saved the last 3 months for speaking practice. During those initial 5 months, I consumed a ridiculous amount of media. I mean, an insane amount. To put it on perspective, I even watched She-Hulk. Of course, I watched everything in French. In the beginning, it was really tough, and I didn't focus much on beginner content. Instead, I jumped straight into intermediate level. You have to remember I already spoke Spanish as my native language and had learned English. Those two languages share so much vocabulary with French that it made sense to skip the basics. That said, I remember that I also watched shows and anime that I had already seen, like Naruto. And then gradually, I moved on to more advanced series and YouTubers. At the time, I was super into Formula 1, so I consumed a lot of French Formula 1 content. Plus, I was starting to get interested in finally learning Japanese. So I followed French YouTubers who lived in Japan or made videos about learning Japanese. I also used Busu, which promised me to teach me up to B2. And I completed 100% of their course back then. It was pretty good. Gave me enough to just keep going through immersion. And after those 5 months of input-heavy learning, I switched gears and focused on speaking. I took 3 to 4 classes a week in Italki, each lasting about an hour, and some were specifically aimed at preparing me for the test because, as usual, there's always a structure for those exams. The results, I passed. I scored a C1 in speaking and a C2 in listening, which was amazing. I couldn't even believe it, but it wasn't just about passing the test. I went from understanding almost nothing in the streets to being able to communicate fluently with friends and colleagues. Once more, my speaking wasn't perfect, but I could articulate my thoughts clearly, and I was happy with my level of French. Now, Japanese. Unlike French, there is no linguistic connection between my languages and Japanese, so there is a much larger gap, and learning the language from scratch it's being challenging. But despite the difficulty, I feel confident that I'll get there because I've experienced that feeling of fluency before. My current method is a combination of reviewing grammar and I guess the conventional learning part while immersing myself in content. I do both simultaneously, gradually increasing the complexity of what I consume as my grammar recognition improves. I don't separate those two aspects, I tackle them side by side. Unfortunately, I don't have as much time as I'd like to dedicate to learning Japanese because my life and responsibilities. But I'm following a similar approach to what worked for me before. The big difference this time is that I've incorporated Anki, basically flashcards. I never thought it was necessary before, but Japanese is so different and the sheer amount of vocabulary I need to learn is huge. And Anki has been a great addition to my study process. So after telling you all these stories, where do I stand again? What do I think about immersion? Does it work? Yes, absolutely. And not only does it work, but I also think it's totally necessary. Whatever way you choose to do it, whether it's reading, consuming media, or just listening a lot, you have to do it at some point. I really believe it's the strongest pillar of learning a language and the language learning journey. No surprise, people have exploited the heck out of it here on YouTube. I'm doing the same right now. On one hand, I think it's good because it helps people understand how important immersion is. But on the other hand, it's always going to be a polarizing subject. Now, do I think you can get fluent by just immersing yourself in the language? Yes, I think you can. But I would tackle the language with comprehensible input first, meaning you understand at least 80% of what's being said, or even 50%, as long as you can follow along with the context. You should also progressively increase the difficulty, and eventually you will get to a point where you can understand even more without really trying. Myself, I also advise a lot to mix it with content you already watch. Doesn't matter the level of difficulty. There's a catch though. Doing just that will take a long time. So long that unless you have no urgency, like I did with my English, I wouldn't recommend relying only on immersion. The best approach, in my opinion, is to combine the progressive overload of input with conventional study. This sounds like I'm kind of like giving you like some exercise or fitness theory, but it works. Now, when I say conventional study, I don't mean forcing yourself into a classroom with a textbook. Today, we have a ton of tools. Use the best app you like. And of course, you can follow YouTubers who teach what's in the textbooks. For instance, Tokini Andy has a playlist covering all the grammar topics from Genki 1 and Genki 2 for those learning Japanese. But to be clear, I don't think you need to drill grammar. You just need to get familiar with the concepts and try to understand them. I think grammar itself is not complicated, at least not in theory. What's complicated is applying the grammar effectively when using the language. So my advice, try to get comfortable with basic and maybe intermediate grammar. Myself, I just really don't mind studying grammar, and so most likely I will also study eventually advanced grammar for Japanese. Honestly, I just don't get the fuss that people make about grammar. I don't think it's a big deal, to be honest. But I understand that people learn in different ways, so I kind of want to make another video about grammar because I have seen so many outrageous comments in terms of how damaging it is for your journey, and I just think it's just an exaggeration, but basic grammar will be enough for your first months or even years of learning a language. By the way, if you don't want to study grammar or do any kind of conventional learning, and instead you just want to dive straight into the language, like watching TV shows, movies, or content you enjoy without worrying about complexity, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. If that's what you want, well, go for it. Personally, I think it's an inefficient approach. That said, I've noticed that on YouTube, people often focus too much on how fast or how efficient a method is, rather than enjoying the journey and staying accountable for the time spent with the language. In the end, if you find a method frustrating and have zero adherence to it, you won't succeed with it anyway. So, if full immersion is what works for you, just jumping in without overthinking, then it can actually be a valid way to start. In the long run though, it won't hurt to occasionally look up words you keep seeing or check grammar patterns when they start repeating. Learning in context like that can make things stick better, and looking something up every now and then isn't going to ruin your experience. One thing you'll definitely need if you take this approach is resilience. There will be long stretches where you don't understand a thing, and that can be definitely overwhelming. Motivation alone won't keep you consistent because at some point it will fade, and I just don't have a perfect solution for that. Just know that this is something you'll likely face. If you can push through, maybe this method will work for you. How long it takes will vary, and your native language plays a huge role. For example, if I immerse myself in Portuguese or Italian, I'd probably pick up a lot just by listening without needing to study vocabulary. But with languages like Mandarin or Korean, it would be a completely different story. Much harder and taking many years. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually super curious of how it is the journey of someone that only learns through immersion, like pure immersion, nothing else. That actually led me to find a method that is dreaming Spanish, and I'm currently checking out some similar resources for Japanese, but I think I prefer to dive deeper into those in a later video. So far, I think immersion helps improve your understanding of a language in different areas, but when it comes to speaking, I believe active practice is necessary. Even though after years of consuming English, I was able to speak and pass an English test, which to be honest doesn't say much. And at the time, I didn't feel comfortable speaking. I hesitated a lot and made way too many mistakes in regular conversations, and I distinctly remember the fatigue it caused. I had to focus so much that the speaking felt like work rather than just a natural ability. So no matter what method you use, in the end, it all comes down to tons of practice. Your brain needs to get used to recalling words quickly and finding ways to communicate ideas with ease. On top of that, muscle memory plays a huge role in pronunciation. You need to train your mouth to emulate the sounds you hear from native speakers. I don't think there is a way to avoid active practice. Nowadays, early speaking is super important to me. I didn't emphasize it much before because my experience with English and French was different, but now with Japanese, I really want to start producing output early. So as you can see, even though I learned in a certain way before, I'm still making adjustments in this journey. Looking back, what hurt my progress with those languages was not practicing speaking at all, or having any real motivation to improve, until I was in a situation where I actually had to use the language. Now, about all the debate on YouTube about immersion, should you do it, should you not? My final thoughts are that everyone is just different, and you need to try different methods to see what suits you best. Maybe you don't want to do immersion right now because it feels too early, and that's okay. Do what feels right for you. I think immersion from day one is beneficial, even if it's just basic content. Finally, I'm making this video partly because I've been feeling down. Sometimes I feel disappointed with my progress in Japanese. Of course, I don't spend as much time as I'd like, but you have those days of frustration where you don't understand anything. But I wanted to remind myself of how the journey has been so far, and I wanted to share my experience with you so you can have a better idea of what this process is like. I personally enjoy watching other YouTubers and seeing how their language journeys are going, and this topic of immersion has been stuck in my mind for a while because it's been such an essential part of my journey that I wanted to clarify a few things. I'll leave links and channels I mentioned in the description, so check them out if you are interested. And that's it for today. I'll see you in another video.